we're going to like interview about the ideate. Yeah. Because our project in learning media design is about ideate, and we're thinking about redesign ideate, because we have
gallery.
Oh yeah,
Gallery, yeah.
Gallery, not the whole idea.
Not the whole thing. Yeah.
Not the whole, of course
good.
not.
It's a short semester, so yeah.
Yeah, and we firstly we want to know that maybe I heard that a lot of professors are using ideate. We like
gallery
interview. Oh, gallery. Sorry, are using gallery, and we have interviewed like Derek. Yesterday, and he was using it as a kind of documentation part. Yeah, I want to know that like what kind of role ideate plays in students' learning right now.
So the gallery or ideate in general?
The gallery.
The gallery.
Yeah.
So the gallery, the main intention of it is to, because there's a couple different strands. So the most practical one is that it provides a sort of like learning ground for students who are at various levels of familiarity with documentation and reflection practices. Because ideate, the program in general, is open to students from any major, so some students are, very familiar with documenting, sort of constantly building a portfolio, reflecting on their work, and some students are less familiar with those practices. So the gallery tries to be sort of agnostic and sort of saying, like, if you already know about documenting your work, great, you can go ahead and get started. But if you're not necessarily comfortable with it, here's sort of like a pretty self-explanatory exercise and just sort of some basic practices that you would want to incorporate when you're thinking about doing a portfolio. So whether that's something you would be doing further as a student or as a professional, it just gives you some basic questions to sort of ask yourself about the work that you've been doing, so that you can sort of gain a deeper understanding of what you've been doing as part of the assignment. It also, sort of a secondary goal or secondary intention of the gallery is to provide sort of like a digital meeting space for students who are participating in ideate, so that they can have a chance to sort of see what students in other classes are doing, see if there are some nuances in how a student from a very different discipline than theirs approaches problems or ideas, or how they're able to pivot when a project doesn't go the way that they thought it was going to go. Which is a nice idea if you have, say, someone who is a design student and they want to kind of, they look at the work of a computer science student who was doing the same project as them and see, well, when they had this problem, like, here's how they handled it, or vice versa. So just allowing students to sort of get a glimpse into how students from other disciplines work and react, and how they come up with ideas. And from a practical perspective, the gallery is set up so that it's voluntary. Students don't have to share their work with other people. It's really just sort of like, this is an interesting thing that we all happen to be doing here as CMU students, and here's like a glimpse into some of the stuff that we've been doing, in a way that's intentional, and so that they can actually go to a place that is, everyone is consented to be there, and get to see what the other people are doing. And then it also, to the degree that, parts of it can be public facing, it's very nice for people who are prospective students, or who are parents, or who are just interested in seeing some of the things that CMU students are doing, and they hear about something like ideate, and they're kind of, trying to crystallize what it is exactly the students do in an ideate program, just sort of giving them a really quick glimpse into, I had this team of students who was like a really interesting mixture of disciplines, and this is a project they all work together on. So just getting a sense for those different types of audiences, both from the students who are actively in ideate and their instructors, the external participants who are sort of like curious about what we're doing, and then also just for the students to be able to view and review each other, whether they're in a current class or they're looking back at students who are in the class that they took in a previous semester, see if it's changed or progressed at all.
Got it. Yeah. It sounds like a multi-function thing, but I think maybe this kind of like purposes are kind of different, because for students who want to just record something or document his or her own work, it will be more rough, may not that dedicated for like others to view it.
Right. Yeah. No. So those secondary audiences, if they're not necessarily, if they gain any benefit from it, that's wonderful, but that's not necessarily the primary goal of the IDA gallery. So it's most important that it serves the students and faculty who are actively teaching a course and using the gallery for those documentation practices.
Okay, so the primary like purpose for gallery is more based on the curriculum for
Sure. Yeah. So So if you're teaching a course, and you'd like to be able to have documentation or reflection practices be something that is either an explicit or implicit learning objective for your course, this is something that could be a really nice tool for that.
Yeah. Got it. Okay. And another one is that do you have like any envision for gallery? I mean, in the future, what will it be like? Be more like to an open platform across universities?
I think something like that would be great. It's very ambitious to even envision how that would happen. All of the departments and all of the colleges have sort of like their own unique cultures, and so their own ways that they go about doing these types of practices. So in some schools it might be seen as maybe overly redundant. The students already have a documentation practice that they share with each other. Are these your classmates?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you can let them in.
Take photos.
Oh, sure, yeah, come on in, no problem. As far as the gallery being a university-wide resource, I think that would be wonderful. I think it would be a really, really interesting exercise to get sort of a snapshot in any given semester. Like, here's a lot of the work that the students did this semester, whether in IDA classes or just their home department classes or Stucos or anything like that. And thinking, because we're physically in the library, I do talk to the university archivist a lot, and so this is the kind of information they're trying to capture all the time, and it's so hard to sort of capture like any kind of glimpse of a moment in the life of a Carnegie Mellon, in general. So having something like that as digital resources become more and more prevalent, I think that's something that's been like pretty exciting for the archivist, because this kind of on October 5th, 2019, what did students learn at Carnegie Mellon that day? And being able to just sort of like, reach back into time that way and to sort of think about what was important in the curriculum, not just in one program, but across the university, would be really exciting. So, I think it'd be something that would be a great option to kind of like, maybe to make the burden on it as little as possible, so that departments would feel like sort of incentive to kind of contribute to the collective memory of learning that happens here at the university, and provide a couple of different options for making it something that would be an interesting thing to do, but not necessarily an overly time consuming thing for them to do.
But I heard like from some students that they think like documentation are kind of time consuming, because it really need to like do some translate some transcripts or take pictures all the time. Yeah, I think there are barriers. So can we like the gallery help them with it, or
can the existing technology in the gallery help them with it? I don't know. I mean, I think that's probably dependent on the project. I think that for aspects specifically like transcribing, I think there's sort of like a general technical solution that is probably several years away, at least at this point, for making that process easier. In terms of sort of capturing, in my interactions with the gallery, sort of like giving you opportunities to kind of capture your reflections on a project sort of like as it's evolving. So we're trying to do this specific we were trying to do this specific thing on an Arduino, and here's what, how we coded it, and here's what we thought was going to happen, and that's not what happened. And so here's how we went back and fixed it and corrected it. So those kinds of documentation practices, are, I think, very useful just for, yourself as a learner, but also for other people who are coming behind you and sort of thinking about how would we do that. For the larger documentation and reflection goals, that can be kind of, harder to encapsulate. Like, what did this project mean to me? How do I feel differently about myself, than I did 6 weeks ago? And the answer might be nothing. I don't feel like, like I'm glad it's over, like that kind of thing. Like those are all worthwhile reflections too. So I think that students don't necessarily, they shouldn't feel overly burdened to sort of like make the whole thing meaningful. Sometimes you do an exercise and it just doesn't totally hit home for you in terms of like your learning experiences, and that's totally valid too. So I think students should not be afraid of documentation. They should try not to view it as something that is overly burdensome. And if there are specific aspects that would make the whole thing like not worthwhile, then see if there's a way to kind of like bypass that somehow. So especially for something like transcribing, where like we just don't have the technology to do that quickly and efficiently yet. What else can you take away from a project that can be documented and reflected upon?
I heard that some professors tend to use some templates to help students document in gallery, and I think in general, will the gallery have like next step to help students in this way? Maybe provide them different like templates, or other things.
Should it provide different types of templates?
I mean, do we have like more steps to help students with these things to get familiar with the platform, or like?
So like, if they're not actively using the gallery, is there sort of like some takeaways they could take into a future project, or?
It's kind of like that. And moreover, it's like if I'm a student, I'm really new to gallery, and there anything that we are planning to do more to help students get familiar with the platform, and then help them to get more from the platform.
So I think probably something that would be interesting is if you were able to kind of choose your own priorities in terms of documentation. So if you were, like, say you took an IDA class and your class used IDA Gallery, and then you as an individual wanted to continue using it as a repository for your work, sort of being able to set up, like, I'm going to be documenting this project that I'm working on, and these are the things that I want to capture. Maybe not necessarily all the documentation practices that the gallery sort of defaults to are important to me. So being able to sort of like custom fit, a documentation instance would be a really nice option for students. So maybe they don't need to answer all of the questions, or can sort of, have there be a way that they can kind of like bypass it in a way that indicates to someone who else was reading it that this was not an important priority at the time, so we skipped it.
Got it. I mean, you just mentioned that there are a lot of like student feedback from the gallery and how they use it and their problems. Could you please like share some of their feedbacks with us?
Oh, so actually I have not been the recipient of student feedback. So Dara would probably be, Dara's the main administrator for the gallery, and so probably if there's student feedback, it's probably going to him.
Okay, so maybe share more something about the current like biggest barriers for students, or the biggest problem for current gallery.
So I think probably the biggest barrier right now is that there are some faculty who use it, and there are some who initially did not have that great of experience with it, and then just did not adopt it as part of their course practice. So in terms of like a resource that would be helpful for IDA as a program, but also as an asset to the university for them to be able to point to something and say like, this is what our students have been doing. I think having sort of like a training session or a meeting with the faculty as users to say like, what are some improvements that we can make that would, make it more worthwhile for you to use this. And then, understanding that, like, some professors just have, like, their repository of choice that they just really, they much prefer, and that's fine as well. But I think reaching out to some of the IDA faculty and maybe giving them a chance to kind of, like, sit down with Dara and perhaps another, person who would be able to do a little bit more of the hands-on support day to day. And maybe there are some small changes that can be made on the interface side so that the faculty will be a little bit more, readily, turning to it for some, if not all of their, documentation opportunities.
So better communication with professors and students would be a great improvement for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think. So
Oh yeah. So like you said that so can I say that currently Gallery is a special platform for ideate programs?
So it was grown out of IDA, but I don't know if it's been adopted in non-IDA classes. But I think the primary source for the content is from IDA classes, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So in a higher level, like when students are learning and using Gallery, you think what kind of things they could get through this process? Like, for example, cultivate their habits of document. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. So I think the key benefit of it is that you get familiar with documentation and reflection practices, which is, in my opinion, good practice for someone from any discipline. So maybe there are some coincidental things that we try to facilitate through Ideate so that you actually get a chance to see if there are if you get a chance to work with somebody where documentation is already baked into their discipline, so working with designers or writers or artists where people have to constantly sort of think about what they've been doing, sort of getting a chance to sort of see what they do and what they prioritize and what information they collect. So in terms of having it be somewhat accessible to students in the classes that they're in, being able to see what their colleagues, their classmates are doing is really helpful.
Yeah, so this kind of mixed ability environment could enhance the using of Gallery.
Yeah.
Got it.
So I wonder, I'm really interested in what we are doing for galleries, like what we are doing for galleries to be better. What are we aiming for right now?
What should you be aiming for?
No, I mean what maybe you as a instructor aiming for a gallery right now?
So I think in my role, I think I would like to see it. I would like to see it more widely adopted amongst the IDA classes. I think it's a really interesting audience in terms of a test case to kind of think about, if something like this were to be adopted more widely across the university, here are some, things that we've tripped over, and here are the things that were really successful, because you would be having, presumably people from any different number of disciplines using it. I think that is something that comes down to support structures for the gallery. So being able to have, one or more people who would be able to respond to in the moment issues that people are having, like I'm having trouble signing up, or I tried to, do this specific thing with it, I ran into a problem, or if there are generally ideas about, there are some small revisions that could be made to the IDA gallery, and we as users would be able to provide so having some kind of regular user feedback sessions to sort of say, here's what has been working and here's what hasn't been improved in some time, and here are some directions that would be some good avenues to pursue. So having more interaction between the administrative side and the user side would be really beneficial. I don't know that there's been like much discussion between the users and administration in a couple of years. So having some kind of like user testing would be really beneficial for it. So yeah.
So in this period, any iteration of gallery it's made just by like engineer or designers of this?
By Dara, yeah.
Oh, by Dara.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cause I can see from the gallery, I have like getting to the website and have some quick look for some time. I can see that most projects there are based on the curriculum, so most of their projects are not so dedicated. It's kind of like rough and just to record some small paragraphs and some pictures on it. And I think it's not really, it looks like not really for others to see it, or for it's a branding for ideate thing. Yeah, but I think the use of gallery right now is based on classes, so students more see it as assignments. Yeah. But I think like the project in IDA is really like fancy and really good. Yeah. And how we can like combine this together, or is there any plan for us to like combine these things together?
So have the content in the gallery be more reflective of the work being done in IDA. I think that is probably making just the practice of the gallery be more robust. So having it, I think the easiest way to sort of like, direct people there is through a class. So say, that's sort of like the easiest context to sort of say, like, you've been doing projects in this class and you've been thinking about them. Why don't you capture those projects and those thoughts here, during this semester? And, I think outside of that, getting the students to sort of like maybe return to it or to keep it in mind somehow, maybe like once a year we do like a massive, call for projects to, course or otherwise, just like anything that you've been doing, that you've been working on, that you think would be an interesting piece to feature in the gallery, would be nice. But then we would also have to kind of, I could see something like that quickly getting out of hand, where like, oh, well, I made this costume for my pet, and like, like suddenly you have just like everything there. Not that it would get like, completely out of hand quickly, but having a little bit more opportunity to kind of promote the gallery as a tool that students can turn to for coursework, or like, having some parameters where they could think about, this would be a really nice project to add to the gallery, even though it's not an ideate class that I'm taking right now. But, my School of Art class that has some like, commonalities with ideate, or just is an interesting project for me, who identifies as an ideate student, will be a good addition to that in terms of, for people to be able to see it.
But are there a lot of like ideate program on the website right now?
What's that?
Are there a lot of ideate program on the website?
On the ideate website?
No, on the gallery.
Oh,
I guess there are not so many.
Not so many programs on it?
Not so many like ideate program.
So ideate isn't very much like presented in the gallery. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because when I like getting to the website, the first like very obvious like projects are all like IoT classes. Yeah, and I think that's due to the current user base, which is probably a little stale. So there's been like a few dedicated users of it for the past few years, but I don't think, like I said, I don't think that there have been many instances of faculty, going back to it and adopting it, or maybe didn't have that great of an experience when it initially was rolled out, and haven't had a chance to kind of, go in and test it out again. So it hasn't been something that has been widely adopted by the rest of the ideate faculty. So do you have any expectations for our redesign project? I mean, any like directions or?
I mean, I think like in terms of the visual part or the what are your goals for the redesign? Are you still like figuring those out?
Yeah, we're
Okay.
like sort of figuring it out.
Yeah. So I think that from my perspective, like I said, like having some suggestions for you know, broadening the user base so that it was more widely adopted by, you know, more faculty, even if they didn't want it to be their primary source of documentation for their students, having, you know, some conversations with faculty to say like what are your initial pitfalls for using this software, what are some barriers to entry that are making you not want to engage with it, because I think that having conversation with the faculty would be really instrumental. So because they would then be able to say like, hey, for this class, for this semester,
Right.
making this, you know, and I hate to make everything an assignment or requirement, but sometimes you do have to kind of like provide some structure in terms of here's how we're going to do this, and here are some good expectations to set for yourself and for me. So, you know, giving like maybe like a test group of faculty a chance to say like, what would incentivize you to use this for one or more instances for projects in your class, and you know what have been the problems that you've used in the past if you've not used it, or if you're a new user, what does immediately sort of like throw up a roadblock for you, and getting them in a space where they can actually like honestly encourage their students to use it, because it would be something that would be you know, good for their students in the class, and you know, hopefully a practice that they take beyond the class, but you know, within the context of a semester, actually giving them, you know, some resources to happily use it, and they're not, you know, fumbling with sign on or, you know, getting approved, that kind of thing. Creating a new project. So I think that there are some like user interface fixes that are, I don't want to say they're easy to make, but there's probably a little bit of a redesign there in terms of thinking about it from the perspective of one or more different types of users, that would make it more widely used, and then that would give you the data to sort of think about what is the next iteration of this site now that it's been around for, you know, 4 years. It's probably well within time to sort of like making some thinking about like what's next for this platform. But you really need, you know, feedback from users, and people who are actually interested and invested in using it more often. So I think for right now, it's been sort of in this holding pattern where you have sort of the same people going back to it time and time again. And the problem with that is that you can adapt to whatever. So like, if, you know, you always run into this quirk of, you know, signing on to it or creating a new project or something like that, you eventually like figure out your way to work around that, and it's not a problem anymore. You don't see it as a bug. But a new user or a set of new users would look at it and say, well, why is it like this? Can't we change this? And so getting able to capture that data would give you a little bit more room to improve it. When you have this sort of like dedicated user base that never grows and never changes, it can stay that way forever and everyone can adapt to it. But thinking about, you know, how does this become something that is a wider resource, that is, you know, something that a lot of different types of people will be able to use, that requires some wider user testing and exposing the software to some feedback that says like, these are the things that need to be changed in order for it to actually get to a point where you can think about what are some bigger directions for it.
Yeah, I want to ask that, what are the other users? Who are the other users besides the students who are taking classes?
So the primary other users are, I think 2 or 3 other faculty that I know of who use it sort of semi-regularly. And there again, you know, I think they use it maybe once a year, maybe twice a year for their classes. And they're able to kind of, you know, navigate around any hiccups in terms of like the user experience. But I don't know that there have been new faculty who have signed up to use it in at least a year, as far as I know, but I don't know for sure. Yeah.
Why these like faculties are using it once a year? I mean, it's only one project and they last for the whole year long?
I think they're using it like per course. So if we have a faculty member who teaches one IDA course, this is sort of like when they think about it. Yeah.
Got it. So it seems like we can like interview more faculties to get maybe what they think.
So if I was in your position, I would probably, and since Dara is sort of like the key stakeholder, Dara or I, could suggest like, these are some classes that would be really, really nice to see them represented in the IDA gallery. And, having, a little bit more breadth of the IDA experience. So having some more game design classes, having more animation classes, having more physical computing classes, being able to see like the scope of what are the different types of classes that we offer, and maybe speaking to a faculty member or an instructor from one class per area and sort of saying like, we're going to run like a test instance where, you sign up for the gallery, and you want your students to do one project, just not a whole semester, just one project, so that the scope is not too intimidating for them. And capturing some data from them in terms of like, was this a useful exercise for your students? Was, from the technical end, were there any hiccups in terms of like getting signed up, adding their projects? Is there anything in terms of the actual documentation prompts that doesn't make sense? Could these questions be asked differently or in a way that, is a little bit more applicable to what you're doing? So I think getting some user testing from the faculty end would be hugely beneficial, and gathering a small, 3 or 4 people who would be willing to kind of try that out would be really, really helpful in making some suggestions for where the gallery could be improved.
There's a point that confused me a bit, because it's like that what our no matter our potential users or current users are, or curriculum based, they're like IDA instructors and like students who are taking classes, but for the next vision part, we are more likely to make it into a branding for CMU or like open platform. It's kind of like disconnected to me right now.
So how to translate the IDA users into the general CMU user base?
Because I heard that maybe our next step, or the part we want, aiming for, is to make it more like open platform and into a wider use based platform. But the potential users right now and the current user right now are still like these instructors, and the students are taking these classes. It's kind of narrow based. So I think these two are kind of like disconnected to me right now.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm thinking about it from my perspective, and since I'm like within the IDA program, and it's something that I think would be really, really useful for IDA in general to be, more widely adopted. And this could be, like my bias, but I think that IDA is a good testing ground for having, if you're looking for something to be a little bit more open to the rest of the CMU community, IDA is probably a good testing ground for that, because you do have faculty from a variety of different backgrounds here, so who have like different levels of familiarity with documentation and teaching documentation practices to students who are either, native to documentation practices or brand new to it. So I think that, if there is the possibility of scaling it up to a wide CMU wide resource, IDA is a probably good testing ground for that.
So for you, talking about like the faculty and students are all have different kinds of familiar degree with the documentation. So the aim of gallery is to training them, or like help them to learn to a better a deeper understanding of documentation, or just give them freedom to documentation.
That's a good question. I guess it depends on what kind of baggage you're bringing into the documentation process. So if it's something that is, you've done before, and it always makes you feel intimidated about it because you're not really sure how to reflect on something, or you've done it a lot and it's annoying, or you've done it a lot and it's very beneficial for you. I think that's a tough one to answer, because I think it sort of depends on what kind of emotional state is the user in at the moment when they're walking up to the gallery and saying okay, I'm going to engage with this platform now. So I think from my perspective, I think that speaking as sort of if I can put myself in the shoes of being the representative for Ideate, from our perspective, I think that Ideate is so unique to CMU, and part of what we want to capture is what was it like working on this project specifically, because it is unique to the specific students in the class being at this specific school. So not to say that Ideate is this unicorn in higher education, but you do have some really interesting people who are would not necessarily be in the right context at other universities. So this university attracts people who are just kind of a little off in a really great way, and so being able to sort of get them in a room together and sort of capture even just the slightest insight into what it was like for a poet to work on a game with a trombone player, and kind of what are some specific interactions that you took away from that would be useful, or just major day, or actually were meaningful to you in the longer term. So because those are the kinds of interactions that you have at Ideate and at Carnegie Mellon, being able to capture some of those I think is really interesting, and that's what I want to see happen in the gallery. So in terms of I forget what the original question was.
Okay.
Sorry.
So with that part, I think I began to feel the two goals of gallery. One is we always focus on documentation, but I could say that more than beyond the documentation is more to represent the ideas from students.
Okay.
The author part is the people parents or people who are interested in that, they could say all the ideas and some really good projects from there. That's one goal.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the primary goal is and should always be, strengthening documentation practices, for both the students, but also, people who are also in the class, who are teaching the class, people who just happen to be students here who want to, sort of see what, get some insight into what other people learn. As a secondary goal and more of a benefit is, people to get some inspiration into, here's a project that went horribly, and, here's how they survived and woke up the next day and kept going and, and tried again. But here's also a project that was very successful despite some setbacks, and, how do we kind of capture, all of those experiences to the degree that we can. Yeah.
So the primary goal it's still the documentation. Yeah. So it's more an inner goals. I feel it's inner the program, our course.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think it's safe to say that most of the programs at CMU have that documentation or reflection somewhere in their curriculum, whether it's something that is mentioned within the first few paragraphs of their mission statement, or something that naturally becomes, maybe is not implicitly or explicitly stated, you will document, your work, but just kind of as a matter of practice. So it might not be the case that people think about, when I'm, taking notes, I'm documenting, but that's documenting. And so sort of being able to look back at that in a way and sort of, constantly be able to refer back to that is something that, I think the gallery would be a really useful tool for that to happen on a wide scale and say hey, we're all documenting these things. This is something that we all do in some capacity, and here's one way to think about it. in the context of IDA classes or non-IDA classes, or just as a CMU student, being able to capture those and sort of say, like, you are documenting, you're reflecting, and this is, like, a good that you do that. And maybe it was something that you didn't realize that you were doing because it was, something in your science class, but it's sort of fundamentally the same thing that a writer does when they're constantly adding pieces to their portfolio and saying, this is what my goal was, and here's how I achieved it, and here's how I didn't. So the documentation aspect, I think, should always be the primary goal.
Okay. So are we thinking of to make the maybe gallery into students' part of portfolio?
So like their individual portfolio?
Yeah, individual portfolio.
That would be great. But knowing that, there are 5,000 students here, and there's probably 5,000 different goals that they're pursuing in terms of their personal portfolios. I think it would be really nice if they were to, if they have a website as their portfolio, to say here's my CV, and here is some examples of my work, and also here's a link to the gallery at CMU where I participated in this class, and as part of the class we documented our just to get a sense of, and that may be appropriate especially at the beginning of someone's career when they're sort of trying to bridge the gap between their experience and their knowledge, when you have that kind of uncomfortable period where you haven't really worked anywhere yet, but you can, and being able to show people I might not have been getting paid for it, but I did actually I've been doing this kind of stuff in an intellectual context, and I'm ready to do it for money. So being able to be a component of somebody's broader portfolio, I think, would be really nice. I think it would be something that really gives, a prospective graduate school or prospective employer really, really nice insight into what has this person been a part of, and being able to see something like that on a snapshot would be really cool. I would be really impressed, actually, if I was able to see something like that. So.
Provide some evidence that you're really engaged in
these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay. I'm done with question. Do you have any?
So for all the gallery-based questions, have you I just wonder how many classes are using gallery right now, because I feel like what we know is basically just Dara's classes. And
yeah, I think it's 2, maybe 3.
2 other faculties.
Right. Yeah.
Can we have the course
name? I don't see why not. But I can check with to see if they would be willing to talk to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. And we also want
TA.
Yeah.
And we want to have some extra interview with some teaching assistants who
are
related
maybe.
to the course.
I don't know if there's any TAs that are actively part of the classes that are doing the gallery right now. I don't know if they exist. So yeah.
So only Dara.
So Dara, there was another faculty who. He's an adjunct who's teaching a course in DIY design and fabrication. So I believe he's doing it. And he might have a TA. I don't know for sure, though. And I don't know if the TA works with the gallery at all. The TA might be not in that aspect of the course. But I can ask him.
Who is the professor? Can we know?
His last name is Deramo, D''ERAMO. And the course that he's teaching is 24672.
24672.
Yeah.
Okay.
The reasons other faculties don't use gallery is probably because they have other documentation tools.
So I think it's partially that. I think it's also partially that when the gallery was first launched, there was some people had problems with it, and I think that they felt they just weren't addressed and they weren't heard, and so they just kind of didn't bother with it after that. Like I said, if you would like some information about types of professors who I think would be open to trying it, who maybe haven't like visited it in some years, I could definitely give you some context to reach out to there. Like people who I would like to see using the gallery.
Okay.
So yeah.
Cool. That would
Yeah.
be nice.
Yeah.
And can we get the contact?
Yeah. Well, I'll email them to you
Oh,
because
cool.
yeah, so you just have to
Cool.
think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of classes here are need this like documentation.
Mhm.
Process book or design
Yeah.
classes
Mhm.
really need process book. It
Mhm.
will be a great tool
Yeah.
to use.
Yeah, and in some classes, you know, their documentation might actually be thinking about like we want something that is more outward facing, and so like you're sort of getting students familiar with those types of platforms. In which case, this would not necessarily be the most appropriate use of their class time, which is fine. You know, I think that, you know, on the individual level, the faculty have to do what is right for their course. But there are some courses that I don't think are currently like using anything that it would be great to sort of like capture at the bare minimum, like maybe one project that the students are working on, and just sort of seeing what are some of the outcomes that come from that. Yeah.
And also another problem is like our program has our own gallery, and
Oh.
this is the idea gallery. Do you know why they are not
They're
put
not
on
integrated.
their
Yeah.
same platform?
Why are they not on the same platform?
Yeah, why they are separated?
Well, it looks like this looks like another DARA platform. I would imagine that since he is also affiliated with the I Institute, I imagine that he sort of like did the same thing for that program.
Oh,
Um, so, yeah.
That's similar.
Yeah, all the things are very, and I didn't know the existence of the idea gallery before this class. I only know that apparently our program has this gallery.
Oh yeah, oh, that's funny. Yeah,
Okay. So you
Yeah.
don't know the reason.
I didn't know.
Another problem is that do we have the access to the data like their actual active users, or is there like how many exactly how many students or teachers are using the gallery?
I would ask Dara for that because I have some like limited administrative access, but I don't think I have access to how many people are active users.
Okay.
Yeah.
Moreover, if we can like get to this feedback from students would be better. If we can
Get
see
feedback from students.
and see this feedback, to read this feedback from
Oh.
students.
If they've been reporting issues with it, yeah. So
Yeah.
Dara would have that.
Oh,
Yeah.
do you have more questions? No. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
I'll
you.
finish.
Yeah, no
Thank you
problem.
so
If you have
much.
any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out, and I'll send you the names of some